When I woke up that night, I never imagined I'd see the person I raised turn on me in such a terrifying way. My son, Jeremiah, the boy I once held in my arms, the boy I cheered for in every school play, had become a man I barely recognized, angry, unpredictable, and, as I would soon learn, dangerous. Before we begin, please take a moment to leave a comment telling us what everyday sound always gives you a fright and subscribe to the Voices of Our Mothers channel. We're building a community focused on finding strength when you least expect it. Now, back to the chilling truth lurking next door. Now let's get back to the story. It was late, the rain tapping against the kitchen window like a warning I couldn't hear soon enough. I was wiping dishes when he stumbled in, his words slurred, his eyes wild. One moment, he was complaining about the unfairness of life. The next, his hand was raised. The force of it knocked me to the linoleum floor. Pain flared, not just in my body, but deep inside my heart. I sat there, shocked, unable to comprehend how my own child could hurt me. I will not lie, fear gripped me. The bruises already forming on my arms and shoulders were more than physical. They carried shame, confusion, and heartbreak. But through that fear, a tiny spark of resolve began to flicker. I realized in that moment that I could no longer be powerless. I refused to live in terror in my own home, and I refused to let this chapter of our lives end in silence. The house was quiet now, except for the rain and the occasional groan of the old pipes. Jeremiah had passed out, exhausted from his rage, completely unaware that a storm of a different kind was quietly building around him. In that stillness, I began to plan, not out of anger, but from a deep, steady determination to protect myself and, if possible, guide him toward the help he so desperately needed. Before I took any action, I picked up the phone and called people I trusted. My neighbor, retired Judge Bernice Johnson, whose wisdom and presence could hold even the most tumultuous of rooms, and Detective David Miller, who had watched over our church community for decades. I knew they could provide both authority and safety for what was to come, and so, as the rain fell harder against the windows, I quietly whispered to myself, "Tomorrow, you will see that I am not afraid. Tomorrow, justice will be served." I've lived in Savannah all my life, in a little brick house my late husband, Samuel, and I built together decades ago. After he passed, the quiet corners of the home seemed to whisper memories of laughter, shared meals, and small everyday joys that I'd taken for granted. It was here, in this house filled with love and loss, that I had raised my 3 children: Jeremiah, my oldest, Marion, my middle child, and David, the youngest. Life after Samuel's death wasn't easy, but I found a rhythm. I worked part-time at the local library, volunteering some afternoons at church, and spent my mornings tending to the little garden Samuel had loved. It was peaceful, predictable, and safe, until Jeremiah's problems began to unravel quietly, like a fraying rope that no one noticed until it snapped. Jeremiah had always been a sensitive child, bright and affectionate, but prone to frustration when things didn't go his way. In his 20s, he moved back home after college with high hopes, but one failed job after another, combined with a growing dependence on alcohol, shifted his personality. The warmth I remembered in his eyes sometimes vanished behind a mask of anger or bitterness. I tried to understand it, to reach him with gentle words, to remind him that mistakes don't define a person. But there were days when I felt invisible, a silent observer of his self-destruction. Marion and David had moved out years ago, starting families and careers in other states. They called often, offered advice, and checked in on me, but the daily reality of sharing a home with Jeremiah was mine alone. I remember sitting at the kitchen table one morning, sunlight spilling through the window, and noticing the bottle of whiskey hidden behind the cereal boxes. I didn't say anything then. I wanted to approach him calmly, with understanding, but the quiet dread had already settled in my chest. It wasn't only the drinking. Jeremiah's anger had begun to seep into every corner of our home. Arguments erupted over the smallest things: misplaced keys, a dirty dish, a forgotten chore. I would try to de-escalate, speaking softly, choosing my words carefully, yet it never seemed to matter. Some nights I'd sit in the living room, clutching Samuel's old armchair, listening to Jeremiah pacing upstairs, muttering to himself, my heart pounding. I feared what I could not yet see, the moment when words might no longer be enough. I've always been a woman who believes in faith, in justice, and in patience. I prayed every night for my children that they would find their way, that they would remember the values Samuel and I had instilled. But I also knew that love doesn't mean submission. Loving Jeremiah didn't mean allowing myself to be hurt. The seeds of resolve were planted quietly, even as I continued to cook his favorite meals, wash his clothes, and try to shield him from the world when life's disappointments struck. On one particular afternoon, I found myself alone in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, when I noticed something unusual. Jeremiah's step was heavier than usual, and his face carried an edge I hadn't seen in days. He didn't speak much, just muttered under his breath while flicking the TV remote between channels. I kept working, telling myself to stay calm, to breathe, to keep the peace. But my intuition whispered warnings. Something in the air that day was different, a tension that felt tangible, like static before a storm. That evening, I made a simple dinner: baked chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans, exactly as Jeremiah liked it. I set the table carefully, placing a small vase of fresh daisies in the center. I wanted to remind myself, and perhaps him, that home could still be a sanctuary, a place of warmth despite the growing darkness. Yet, as I called him to dinner, his eyes met mine with a sharpness that made my stomach tighten. It wasn't just the alcohol or the stress. It was a sense of disconnection, a breaking of trust between us that I hadn't been prepared for. I remembered when he was a little boy, how he used to climb into my lap and tell me about his day, how his laughter could light up a room. And here I was, a mother trying to reach the son she loved, only to feel the distance growing by the day. I tried to focus on the things I could control. I maintained our home, kept our finances in order, and documented every unusual incident quietly. I wasn't naive. I knew the law, the community, and resources were my allies if needed. I reached out to friends I trusted, sharing subtle hints about my concerns without alarming Jeremiah, hoping that if things escalated, I would have a network ready. And yet, for all the planning, all the care, there remained a fragile tension between us. I began noticing small changes: slammed doors, muttered insults under his breath, careless mistakes followed by excuses. My heart ached, but my mind focused on strategy. I knew that love could not coexist with fear. I realized that protecting myself and reclaiming my home might soon become a necessity. As days passed, I began to notice the subtle patterns of his behavior. Late-night drinking sessions that ended in arguments, mornings when he left the house in silence but returned with a short fuse, the way he ignored the simple acts of kindness I offered, as if my presence irritated him. I documented it all quietly in a small notebook: dates, times, actions. It was my lifeline, a way to remind myself that clarity and evidence would guide me when the inevitable moment arrived. And in the quietest part of the evening, when the house was still and the last rays of sunlight glimmered through the curtains, I would whisper to myself, I will not let this define me. I will not let fear take over my life. Tomorrow I will be ready. By the time I went to bed that night, I had a plan forming in my mind, not a plan born of anger, but one rooted in justice, prudence, and the undeniable truth that a mother deserves safety and dignity, even from her own child. The tension between Jeremiah and me had been simmering for years, but that summer, it began to boil over in ways I couldn't ignore. Every morning, I would wake to the sound of his muttered curses or the faint clink of bottles from the night before. I tried to keep my mornings calm, brewing coffee, watering the plants Samuel had loved, and preparing a simple breakfast. But no matter how quiet I tried to be, how soft my words, Jeremiah found reasons to lash out. It started with small things: an argument over the kitchen sink, a spilled cup of coffee, a dish left in the wrong place. I would apologize, even if the fault wasn't mine, hoping to soothe him. But the anger didn't subside, it grew. I could feel it in the way he walked past me without a word, in the sharp glance over his shoulder, in the tension that stiffened the air in our home. One afternoon, I was folding laundry in the living room when he stormed in, slamming the door behind him. "Mom," he snapped, voice shaking with irritation. "Why is the thermostat always wrong? Why is it too hot or too cold?" I tried to answer calmly. "I just said it the way it's been for years, Jeremiah. Maybe it's the weather." But he wouldn't hear it. He shouted, accusing me of trying to control everything, of making him feel unwelcome in his own home. It wasn't only the anger, it was the unpredictability that frightened me most. Some days he would be quiet, almost tender, helping me with chores or offering a small smile. And then, without warning, he would erupt, his words sharp as knives, cutting through the peace I tried to maintain. I found myself walking on eggshells, never knowing what would trigger the next outburst. I confided in Marion over the phone one evening. "He's not the son I raised," I said, my voice breaking. "I don't know how to reach him anymore." She listened patiently, offering gentle advice. "Mom, you have to protect yourself. You can't keep sacrificing your safety for him." Her words were true, but difficult to internalize. Protecting myself felt like admitting defeat, but I knew she was right. Then came the alcohol. I had noticed a small bottle hidden behind the cereal boxes for months, but now it became obvious. Empty bottles appeared in the trash, and the smell of whiskey lingered in the corners of the house. One evening, I found him slumped on the couch, the bottle half empty beside him, muttering to himself about how life had wronged him. I knelt beside him, placing my hand on his shoulder, trying to comfort him, but he pushed me away. His fists were clenched, not just from anger, but from frustration, from a deep sense of failure I couldn't fix for him. The most frightening moments came late at night. I would lie in bed, listening to his pacing upstairs, the floorboards creaking with every step. Sometimes I imagined he was coming down to yell, sometimes to strike, and I would hold my breath until the sound faded. Sleep became shallow and fragmented. I began keeping the doors locked at night, making sure phones were charged and nearby. My heart raced at the slightest sound, a reminder that safety was fragile in my own home. One rainy night, everything came to a head. The storm outside mirrored the storm in our living room. I had prepared a simple dinner: roasted chicken, mashed sweet potatoes, and green beans, Jeremiah's favorite. The smell of the food was meant to soothe, to remind him of family and home. But as soon as he entered the room, the tension was palpable. He was drunk, his words slurred, eyes darting with irritation and rage. "Why are you cooking for me?" he demanded, throwing a spoon across the kitchen counter. "Do you think I need your charity?" I froze, trying to remain calm. "I just wanted us to have dinner together," I whispered. My voice was soft, but it seemed to ignite something in him. He lunged toward me, his hands gripping my shoulders too tightly, shaking me, shouting about failures, about how I never understood him. Pain shot through my body, but more than that, fear gripped me. For the first time, I felt the stark reality that I was no longer just a mother guiding a troubled son. I was a woman in danger. I remember the moment clearly, the rain beating against the windows, the kitchen light reflecting off the countertop, and Jeremiah's face, twisted in anger and frustration. I realized then that this situation would not resolve itself. In the aftermath of that night, I spent hours sitting quietly in my living room, nursing bruises both visible and invisible. I knew I had to act, but I had to be careful. I couldn't allow my emotions to dictate my next move, not when so much was at stake. I began making calls discreetly, to my friend and retired judge, Bernice Johnson, to Detective David Miller at our local precinct. I explained the situation, providing details without exaggeration, emphasizing my concern for both safety and justice. I also began documenting everything meticulously. Every angry word, every act of aggression, every hidden bottle. I wrote it down in a notebook I kept hidden in my bedroom. I took photos of bruises and damage, kept copies of bank statements and receipts, anything that could support me if the law had to intervene. Each entry reminded me that I was not powerless, that preparation could replace fear. The next morning I woke early, the house quiet except for the occasional drip of rain from the gutters. Jeremiah slept, exhausted from his rage, unaware of the plan forming quietly in my mind. I prepared breakfast carefully, setting the table with precision. I baked fresh biscuits, poured peach preserves into a small dish, and brewed coffee strong enough to fill the room with its aroma. The scene was peaceful, deceptively ordinary, yet every detail was intentional. By the time the sun's first rays entered the windows, I was ready. The table was set, the evidence was collected, and the allies I had contacted were on their way. I sat at the head of the table, bruised but determined, waiting for the moment when Jeremiah would walk into a reality far different from the one he expected. I wasn't motivated by revenge, though some might see it that way. I was motivated by justice, by a deep understanding that love for a child does not mean tolerating harm. I wanted him to understand fully that his actions had consequences, that there were boundaries, and that I would enforce them with courage, patience, and dignity. As I sipped my coffee and reviewed the plan in my mind, I felt a calm settle over me, a strange peace that only comes when a person knows they are doing what is right. The storm outside had passed, leaving the streets wet and glistening. I knew that by the time Jeremiah walked down the stairs, everything would change. Not just for him, but for me as well. This wasn't the end, but it was the moment when fear gave way to resolve. The rising conflict had escalated to a tipping point, and I had chosen the path of courage. I reminded myself quietly, I am not just a mother. I am a woman who will protect herself and reclaim her life, no matter the cost. The night before, the storm had been relentless, but the real tempest was about to unfold inside my own home. I had spent hours preparing, setting the scene with quiet precision, knowing that everything depended on timing and composure. The biscuits were baked golden, the peach preserves gleamed in a small dish, and the coffee filled the air with its rich aroma. Every detail was intentional, every movement a step toward reclaiming control over my life. Jeremiah stumbled down the stairs, his hair damp from the rain and the weight of last night's fury still visible in his slouched shoulders. He expected the usual, a mother timid, silent, fearful. But the moment he saw me seated at the head of the table, bruises faint but undeniable, he froze. His eyes darted from the neatly set table to my calm expression, searching for a trace of weakness but finding none. I gestured gently to the seats beside me. "Sit," I said softly, though my voice carried an unmistakable authority. That was all the invitation he needed, or perhaps it was the shock of my composure that rooted him to the spot. I watched as confusion flickered across his face, then anger, then a realization that this was not going to be a typical morning. Before he could speak, the doorbell rang. It was Bernice, my retired neighbor and former judge, along with Detective Miller and 2 officers from the precinct. I had asked them to come quietly to witness the confrontation and ensure safety. When they entered, the room felt charged, not with fear, but with the gravity of impending justice. Jeremiah's jaw tightened. "What is all this?" he demanded, his voice shaky but defiant. I kept my tone calm, measured. "This is breakfast, Jeremiah. For you, me, and our guests, we need to talk about last night." His eyes flicked nervously toward the officers, then back to me. He knew that this wasn't just a mother's scolding. It was the law, the community, and the consequences of his actions all converging in one moment. He had underestimated me, believed that fear would keep me silent. But now, the truth had found its stage. I gestured toward the table. "Every incident, every night of aggression, every bottle you've hidden, we have records. Photographs, written accounts, and eyewitness testimony. You've had years to understand that your behavior has consequences. Now it's time to face them." Jeremiah's face paled, and his usual bravado faltered. He opened his mouth, then closed it, realizing that there was no escape, no quick excuse, no place to hide. The weight of his actions, the physical abuse, the threats, the manipulation was undeniable, and for the first time he felt the sharp edge of accountability. I continued calmly. "I called Bernice and Detective Miller because I value your life and my own. This isn't about vengeance. It's about setting boundaries, ensuring that our family and our home are safe, and helping you confront the choices you've made." For a moment, the room was silent except for the ticking of the wall clock and the distant sound of rain dripping from the eaves. Then, with deliberate care, I reached into my notebook and laid out the documentation. Photographs of bruises, copies of medical notes, dated notes of confrontations, and evidence of the alcohol. Each piece of paper was a reminder that actions have consequences, that silence is not safety. Jeremiah's eyes flicked across the documents, the color draining from his face. He muttered, "Mom, but the words stuck in his throat. He had no excuses left, no defenses strong enough to counter the truth laid before him. I motioned toward the officers. "Jeremiah, these men are here not to humiliate you, but to ensure that you understand the severity of your actions. You will have a chance to make amends, to enter rehabilitation, but it will be on terms that guarantee safety and accountability." It was a turning point not just for him, but for me. I felt a surge of calm authority, a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time, fear no longer dictated my choices. I had transformed my vulnerability into a precise, deliberate act of empowerment. Jeremiah's shoulders sagged. The fight drained from him, replaced by a mixture of shame and dawning comprehension. He could no longer see his mother as a passive victim. I was a force of quiet strength, backed by the law and a community who valued justice over fear. The officers moved quietly, guiding him through the process with measured authority. He was not being punished for malice. He was being held accountable for harm, and he understood it fully in this moment. I watched, heart heavy but resolved, as Jeremiah was led away, not into further chaos, but into the path of rehabilitation and eventual restitution. Once the door closed behind them, I sat at the table, taking a deep breath. The bruises remained, the memories of fear lingered, but so did a profound sense of triumph. I had faced what I once thought unfaceable and had emerged stronger, not hardened, but wise. I knew the road ahead would be long, not just for Jeremiah, but for me. Healing would take patience, and rebuilding trust, even with careful boundaries, would require time. But that morning marked the end of silence, the end of fear, and the beginning of reclaiming my home, my dignity, and my peace. I poured myself a cup of coffee, listening to the soft patter of rain outside. For the first time in years, the house felt truly safe. The turning point had arrived, and with it, the possibility of healing for all of us. I was no longer just surviving. I was finally, deliberately living. The house felt different the next morning, quieter, lighter, as if the walls themselves were breathing relief. Sunlight filtered softly through the blinds, casting gentle patterns on the kitchen floor where just the night before chaos had ruled. I sat at the table, a warm cup of tea in hand, reflecting on what had happened. The events of the previous night weighed heavily, yet alongside the heaviness was a profound sense of calm and empowerment. Jeremiah had been taken for evaluation and rehabilitation, guided not by anger, but by accountability. I knew this was the first step in a journey that would be long and challenging, but it was a path he had to walk if he wanted to repair any of the damage done. The thought of him finally facing the consequences of his actions brought a quiet reassurance. I had stopped being a passive participant in my own life. I had reclaimed it. My neighbors, who had supported me quietly over the years, began to trickle in. Retired Judge Bernice Johnson came by first, bringing a basket of breakfast muffins. She smiled softly, her eyes conveying pride and understanding. "Gwendelyn, you handled this with a wisdom most people never achieve," she said. I nodded, a small smile breaking across my face. It felt good, really good, to be seen not as a victim, but as a woman who had fought for her dignity and won. Detective David Miller also stopped by to check on my well-being. "Everything went as planned," he said, settling into a chair near the window. "You've set boundaries and ensured safety. That's more than many survivors manage to do in a lifetime." Hearing this, I felt a mixture of relief and quiet pride. The law had been a tool, but it was my courage and composure that had shaped the outcome. I spent the day going through the kitchen, repairing small things that had been damaged over time, cleaning away the remnants of tension. Each sweep of the counter, each polished surface was symbolic, reclaiming the space that had once been a battlefield. For years, my home had been filled with fear and uncertainty. Now it was a space of calm authority and hope. My children, Marion and George, arrived later that afternoon. Their hugs were firm, grounding, and filled with unspoken understanding. We spoke softly about what had happened, about the importance of healing, and about the boundaries that would need to remain in place with Jeremiah moving forward. They were supportive, and their presence reminded me that family is not just about blood. It's about love, loyalty, and protection. I reflected on the difficult truth. No one, not even my own child, should have the power to diminish my sense of self. The lessons from this ordeal were hard-earned. Courage does not always roar. Sometimes it is the quiet voice at dawn, saying, "I will not be afraid." I realized that my composure, my careful planning, and my patience had not only protected me but had forced a confrontation that might ultimately save Jeremiah from a path of deeper self-destruction. Later, as the evening light softened the living room, I took a walk through the garden. Rain from the night before had left the roses glistening, and the air smelled fresh, almost cleansing. I paused, taking in the serene moment. This garden, once a mere backdrop to everyday life, now seemed like a sanctuary, a place where healing could flourish. I allowed myself to imagine a future where home was safe, dignity restored, and peace no longer a fragile hope but a lived reality. In the days that followed, Jeremiah began his rehabilitation. Though progress was slow and filled with setbacks, the fear and hostility that had governed our interactions for years started to ease. I kept my boundaries firm, my heart open but cautious. I learned to trust my instincts and to accept that love sometimes requires hard decisions, even when it involves your own child. The community rallied quietly around me. Friends and neighbors checked in, brought meals, offered support, and most importantly, reminded me that I was not alone. That network of care reinforced the truth I had discovered. No matter how isolated one feels in the face of fear, there is always a way to reclaim agency, dignity, and peace. By the end of the month, the house had transformed. The bruises on my body faded, but the lessons etched into my mind remained vivid. I had faced violence, fear, and betrayal, yet I emerged not hardened but stronger, calmer, and more certain of my worth. This resolution was not just about legal victory or physical safety. It was about internal liberation, reclaiming space, authority, and respect that had long been denied. I allowed myself a quiet moment of gratitude. For my children, for the law, for friends, for Judge Burness and Detective Miller, and most of all, for my own courage. I had discovered that the smallest acts of planning, patience, and calm could hold immense power. That morning, the breakfast table had been more than a meal. It had been a symbol of justice, self-respect, and the reclaiming of my life. As night fell, I prepared my home for sleep, laying out my journal, a cup of tea, and a quiet space for reflection. The storm had passed, both outside and within me. I felt at peace with what had occurred, ready to embrace the future with clarity and strength. My home was safe, my heart was healing, and I knew that though the road ahead would require vigilance, I was no longer a passive observer of my own life. The turning point had become a bridge to resolution, and resolution was now a foundation for hope. I finally understood that strength often comes quietly, in measured steps, with intention, patience, and the courage to stand firm. My dignity was reclaimed, my boundaries restored, and the love for my family was tempered with the wisdom of experience. And in that quiet, reflective moment, I whispered to myself, I am free, I am safe, and I will live fully with the peace I have earned. The days that followed brought a sense of quiet victory. My home, once a space of fear and tension, now resonated with peace. I moved slowly, savoring each small task, the way sunlight streamed through the curtains, the faint scent of coffee in the morning, the laughter of my children as they helped me reorganize the living room. Every ordinary moment now felt like a blessing, a gentle reminder that life could still hold beauty even after hardship. Jeremiah began his path toward rehabilitation, and though the journey was long, there was hope in his willingness to confront his mistakes. I watched him with cautious optimism, understanding that love does not mean ignoring wrongdoing. It means guiding, teaching, and sometimes standing firm while letting others face the consequences of their actions. I had learned that true strength lies not in anger or revenge, but in measured courage, patience, and the quiet determination to protect oneself while holding others accountable. I reflected often on that pivotal morning when I served breakfast at the table and called upon Judge Burness and Detective Miller. It was more than a moment of confrontation. It was a declaration that I would no longer tolerate abuse or fear. That moment had set the stage for change, and it had reminded me that control over one's life is never truly lost unless willingly surrendered. In sharing this story, I hope others can find inspiration in the power of self-respect and calm resilience. Life will inevitably bring challenges, sometimes in the form of betrayal, fear, or even violence, but the way we respond can redefine our paths. Choosing composure over panic, strategy over rashness, and courage over submission allows us to reclaim our dignity and our lives. My children, Marion and George, became my anchor during this time. Their support and love reinforce the importance of family bonds that are built on trust and respect rather than fear or habit. And even as I helped Jeremiah navigate his own mistakes, I did so from a place of strength, not weakness, understanding that love and accountability can coexist. The moral of my story is simple but profound. Courage is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, steady, and deliberate. Sometimes it shows up at dawn, in a clean kitchen, with a prepared table and a resolve that cannot be shaken. True strength is claiming your life, your safety, and your peace, no matter the odds, and allowing lessons to emerge even from the darkest experiences. Now, as I sit in my home, finally restored and safe, I feel a sense of gratitude for the clarity I have gained. I have reclaimed my dignity, my space, and my voice. I have learned that age, circumstance, or fear do not define the limits of courage, only our willingness to act when it matters most. And so I whisper a quiet truth for anyone who may be listening. You are stronger than you realize. Stand firm, protect your life, and never let fear dictate your future. The storm has passed, but the lessons remain. I carry them with me, not as burdens, but as guiding lights, reminders that even after the darkest nights, calm, measured courage can lead to peace, justice, and healing.